Picture the image almost everyone conjures when they hear the phrase alien abduction: a small gray figure, oversized black almond eyes, a cold examination table, a needle. That image feels ancient, almost universal, like it's been reported the same way by thousands of unconnected strangers for as long as people have looked up at the night sky. It hasn't. That specific image was assembled almost entirely at the desks and in the hypnosis chairs of a small handful of people over roughly 2 decades starting in the 1980s. An artist turned investigator, two therapists, a university historian, a horror novelist, and eventually a tenured Harvard psychiatrist who gave the whole enterprise something none of the others could: institutional legitimacy. This is the story of how they built it and what happened when the whole thing finally came apart in public. Bud Hopkins wasn't a scientist, a psychologist, or even a full-time UFO researcher when this all began. He was a successful New York abstract painter. In August of 1964, he and two friends watched a dark elliptical object off the coast of Cape Cod, and the experience never left him. He began quietly collecting other people's UFO stories as a side interest, and in 1976, after an account of his involving a case near West Nyack, New York, appeared in the Village Voice, letters started arriving from strangers describing sightings and a smaller number describing something stranger. Drives that should have taken 15 minutes, somehow taking 2 hours, with no memory of where the time had gone. Hopkins began investigating these missing time reports systematically, working alongside Ted Blocher, a director with New York's chapter of the Mutual UFO Network, and a clinical psychologist named Dr. Aphrodite Clamar. Clamar and two other licensed hypnotists Hopkins consulted over the years: Robert Naiman and Gerard Franklin conducted tape-recorded hypnosis sessions with witnesses, all of them, in Hopkins' own telling, personally skeptical going in about whether alien abduction was really happening. All of them, according to Hopkins, kept uncovering detailed abduction narratives from their subjects anyway. In 1981, Hopkins published the results as Missing Time, built around detailed transcripts from hypnosis sessions with a dozen subjects. Under hypnosis, people describe being taken aboard a craft by small, slender beings, 3 to 5 feet tall, grayish-white skin, oversized craniums, black eyes, mouths that were a little more than slits and never seemed to move, and subjected to what read like medical examinations. The book closed with an afterword from Dr. Clamar herself, and her final assessment was considerably more careful than the book's marketing suggested. After more than 50 hours with a dozen subjects under hypnosis, she wrote, she still could not say for certain whether the UFO experience was genuine or whether her subjects were victims of hysteria or of their own delusions. The book and its promotional tour changed Hopkins' life. He and Clamar gave joint press interviews, and from that point forward, the American media had a face and a credentialed collaborator to put alongside the phrase alien abduction. Hopkins became, almost overnight, the country's leading popular authority on the subject, despite having, by his own admission, no formal training in psychology or hypnosis himself. 6 years later, in 1987, Hopkins followed up with Intruders, centered on the case of Kathy Davis, a pseudonym for a young Indianapolis mother whose family, under hypnosis, produced an even more elaborate narrative: repeated abductions stretching back to childhood, gynecological procedures, and what Hopkins came to interpret across some 125 cases he had investigated by that point as evidence of a systematic breeding program: ova and sperm retrieval, artificial insemination, human-alien hybrid children. Intruders spent 4 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was adapted into a CBS miniseries starring Richard Crenna. Around the same period, Hopkins brought in a new collaborator, David Jacobs, a historian at Temple University who had written his 1973 doctoral dissertation on the UFO phenomenon in America and who shared Hopkins' growing conviction that hypnotic regression was the key that unlocked these buried memories. Jacobs went on to build his own independent career doing exactly that, conducting hypnosis sessions with hundreds of self-described abductees over the following decades, despite having no clinical license or formal training in psychology, psychiatry, or hypnosis of any kind. For years, that credential gap didn't seem to slow him down. Then, starting in 2001, one particular case would eventually bring the entire methodology crashing into public view. A woman who later took the pseudonym Emma Woods began telephone hypnosis sessions with David Jacobs in 2001. By 2004, the sessions had grown dark enough that Jacobs told her under hypnosis that she was suffering from multiple personality disorder and introduced a bizarre new narrative in which alien-human hybrids working as secret handlers were reportedly threatening his own life. Woods kept records of nearly everything. Years of taped hypnosis sessions, all recorded with both parties' knowledge, which she eventually made public. The recordings showed a research relationship that had spiraled far outside any recognizable clinical or academic norm. A historian with no license to diagnose anything, diagnosing a dissociative disorder over the phone while building an increasingly Baroque mythology around his own sense of personal danger. When Woods went public and pushed Temple University to respond, the university's position shifted uncomfortably over time. First characterizing Jacobs' work with her as informal oral history collection rather than research, a claim Jacobs himself later contradicted by describing DNA testing he said he'd arranged in connection with the case. The timing made things worse for the entire field, not just for Jacobs. Around the same period, the Woods case became public. Hopkins' own ex-wife, Carol Rainey, published a public account accusing Hopkins of intellectual dishonesty and describing what she had witnessed as a pattern of credulity toward his subject's most extraordinary claims. One skeptical publication described the combined effect as a 1-2 punch that effectively ended the credibility of what had briefly functioned as a semi-organized clinical discipline, sometimes only half-jokingly referred to by insiders as abductology. Hopkins died in 2011, not long after both stories broke. While Hopkins and Jacobs were building their case files, a very different kind of writer was assembling the image that would ultimately do more than any of their case transcripts to fix the grays permanently in the public imagination. Whitley Strieber's 1987 book Communion, a purportedly non-fiction account of his own repeated encounters with small, large-eyed beings at his family's cabin in upstate New York, became a massive bestseller, and its cover is very possibly the single most consequential piece of art in the entire history of American ufology. That cover wasn't a generic illustrator's guess. New York artist Ted Seth Jacobs painted it in his own small apartment, with Strieber sitting beside him through multiple sessions, directing every change in real time. By Jacobs' own later account, essentially the same process a police sketch artist uses with a crime witness, Strieber kept correcting details until, in his own words, the image matched exactly what he remembered seeing. He specifically pushed the portrait toward what he described as fragility and vulnerability, qualities he associated with femininity, even though he had said he has no idea whether the beings have gender at all. What emerged, pale, teardrop-shaped head, small, chinless jaw, two enormous black almond eyes, became one of the most recognized images of the entire decade and effectively standardized what an alien looks like in the popular imagination from that point forward. Bud Hopkins himself publicly hated it, a detail nearly forgotten today. Writing in the MUFON UFO Journal, Hopkins criticized the communion face as anatomically wrong by the standards of his own research case files. The eyes placed too high on the skull, he argued, making the whole head look pinheaded because it failed to show the large, swollen cranium that appeared consistently across his own witnesses' descriptions. Two of the handful of people most responsible for building the modern alien abduction narrative couldn't even agree with each other on what the aliens looked like, and the version that won, that's now stamped on t-shirts, emoji, and Halloween masks worldwide. Wasn't chosen because it was the most consistent with the evidence. It won because it was on the cover of the biggest bestseller. A 1989 television adaptation starring Christopher Walken extended its reach even further. What most of Communion's readers don't know or don't dwell on was that Strieber had built an entire career writing horror fiction before any of this. His 1978 novel, The Wolfen, and the 1980 novel, The Hunger, had already established him as one of the leading voices of a new wave of horror writers, both adapted into feature films, the latter starring Catherine Deneuve. Just 1 year before Communion, in 1986, Strieber published a horror novel called Cat Magic, featuring small, mysterious beings central to its plot. When critics later pointed out how closely those fictional creatures resembled the real visitors he had go on to describe, Strieber didn't deny the resemblance. He offered an unusual, oddly candid explanation instead, that the beings in Cat Magic were, in his own words, an unconscious rendering of the visitors, created before he was even consciously aware they might be real. If Hopkins, Jacobs, and Strieber gave the abduction narrative its imagery and its audience, one more figure gave it something none of them could: institutional legitimacy. John Mack was a tenured Harvard Medical School psychiatrist and a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, about as credentialed a figure as American psychiatry produces. In 1994, he published Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens, a case series built on more than a decade of work with self-described abductees, arguing that their trauma was too consistent and too genuinely felt to be simple fabrication or delusion, whatever was actually happening to them. The book was explosive enough that Harvard's dean took the unprecedented step of appointing a peer committee to formally review Mack's clinical methods. The first time in the university's history a tenured professor had faced that kind of inquiry. After 14 contentious months, the committee's conclusion was a split decision. Harvard reaffirmed Mack's academic freedom to study whatever he wished, while separately, formally criticizing his methods as falling short of rational and scholarly standards. Mack kept his tenure. His standing among his own colleagues never fully recovered. Hypnosis is the single tool underneath nearly every abduction narrative built in this episode, and by the 1990s, the broader scientific and clinical community had largely turned against the idea that reliably recovers buried, accurate memories at all. Memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most cited psychologists in the world on the subject of false memory, appeared on a 1997 Nova documentary that included footage of Hopkins himself conducting hypnosis with two children and identified what she called subtle but powerful suggestive cues shaping their responses in real time. Her broader point, backed by decades of her own research, was blunt. A person convinced of a false memory can react to it with completely genuine emotion and will keep elaborating on the story exactly as if it had really happened, with no ability to tell the difference from the inside. There are more mundane, entirely earthbound explanations for the classic abduction experience too. Sleep paralysis, a well-documented, fairly common phenomenon where a person wakes up temporarily unable to move, sometimes accompanied by a buzzing sound, pressure on the chest, and a powerful sense of a hostile presence in the room. Maps disturbingly well on the abduction narrative's opening beats, missing time and all without requiring anything extraterrestrial. The sensed presence itself has its own dedicated research history. Neuroscientist Michael Persinger, working with engineer Stanley Coren at Laurentian University, spent decades studying what became known as the God helmet, a modified helmet fitted with solenoids, delivering weak, patterned magnetic fields to the temporal lobes. In Persinger's own lab, roughly 80% of the participants reported some kind of sensed presence or altered state during stimulation, which he linked to naturally occurring disruptions in communication between the brain's two temporal lobes, the same neurological territory associated with certain forms of religious and mystical experience generally. It's a tantalizing, tidy explanation for exactly the kind of someone is in the room with me sensation abductees consistently described. It's also contested. A 2005 Swedish attempt to replicate the results, led by researcher Per Granqvist, using equipment borrowed directly from Persinger, found no such effect and concluded the original results tracked far more closely with how suggestible a given participant was than with the magnetic field itself. Persinger disputed the replication's methods. Later, partial replications using different equipment have landed somewhere in between. The debate remains unsettled today, but even in its weakest form, it points towards the same basic conclusion as the rest of the episode. Minds under the right conditions, suggestible or stimulated, reliably manufacture the feeling of an intelligent presence in the room, with or without one actually being there. Separately, research into what psychologists call fantasy proneness has repeatedly found that people who report detailed abduction memories tend to score higher on measures of vivid imagination and absorption than the general population. No evidence of mental illness, but evidence of exactly the kind of mind most susceptible to constructing detailed, emotionally convincing narrative under hypnotic suggestion. Clamar's own afterword shows real documented restraint, a licensed professional refusing to overclaim even while participating in the sessions that built the mythology. What went wrong happened later and more slowly, and not through bad faith on anyone's part at the start. A credentialed structure gradually stripped away until an untrained historian was single-handedly diagnosing psychiatric conditions over the phone, and a horror novelist's own fiction was feeding directly, by his own admission, into what audiences received as literal truth. John Mack's own credibility met its own vivid test, not from a peer review committee, but from a journalist. Donna Bassett, posing as an abductee, spent months as one of Mack's research subjects, ultimately inventing a session in which she claimed to have been kidnapped by aliens during the Cuban Missile Crisis and taken aboard a spacecraft to witness a private meeting between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Mack, by Bassett's own account, took the story seriously. It's about as clean a demonstration as this entire field ever produced of exactly the failure mode Loftus had already identified from a research chair. Genuine emotional investment and total credulity offered in response to a story that was, provably, invented from nothing. The Greys didn't arrive from thousands of strangers independently describing the same craft in the same detail, across a suspiciously narrow publishing window. The specific face people now picture was painted in a Manhattan apartment, directed stroke by stroke, like a police sketch, by one man's describing what he alone remembered. Even his closest collaborator in the field thought he got the head shape wrong. The face, the rest of the mythology arrived from an artist's collected letters, two therapists' hypnosis tapes, a historian who kept going long after any responsible oversight had stopped watching, and finally a Harvard psychiatrist whose credentials briefly made the whole edifice look like legitimate science. The image survived every scandal that followed it and every internal disagreement about whether it was even accurate. It's still the first thing most people picture today, even the ones who've never heard a single one of these names. Bud Hopkins died in August of 2011, just as the Emma Woods and Carol Rainey stories were breaking into wider circulation, effectively closing out what insiders had briefly called the golden age of abduction research. David Jacobs retired from Temple University but continued private research into his 80s, never fully walking back his conclusions. John Mack continued his own work, largely unrepentant, publishing a follow-up book in 1999 until his death in 2004 after being struck by a car while walking in England. By every mainstream account, a tragic account, though it closed the book on the field's single most credentialed defender. Whitley Strieber, now in his 80s himself, still hosts Dreamland, the long-running paranormal radio program he inherited from Art Bell, continuing to write and speak about the visitors nearly 4 decades after that first small, deliberately ambiguous face appeared on a bookstore shelf and quietly rewrote what an entire culture pictures when it closes its eyes and imagines something watching back.